As the various factions of all the world's major religions demonstrate, the question of God's existence cannot be answered theologically, nor can it be answered scientifically. But can it be answered philosophically? To answer the question, is there a God, one first must decide what is meant by the term God. If one approaches the question from a biblical perspective, one is trapped into considering only the characteristics of a personal deity which is presumed to exist. The question should not be, for example, does Yahweh exist? It must be built on a broader definition of what the concept of God means. To this end, and for the purposes of this presentation, the definition of God I will examine is the one chosen by Richard Dawkins in his book The God Delusion. Paraphrasing a physicist named Steven Weinberg, Dawkins defined God as a supernatural creator that is appropriate for us to worship. The question then becomes, is there a supernatural creator that is appropriate for us to worship? The concept of God can be broken down until it is used to explain away anything that we don't yet understand about how the mechanics of the universe and life came to their present state, and what happens to our sentient self once we have died. As the answers become known, the definition of God may be changed, but the central undefined concept of an intelligence which is separate from the creation, or part of it, or both, remains. Thomas Aquinas posited 5 supposed proofs for the existence of God. The third of his proofs suggested that God is necessary. He argued that the mechanics of the universe are evidence of divine guidance and planning. This view was later mirrored by William Paley in his watchmaker argument. He suggested that if we find a watch on the ground, we do not presume that it formed there randomly. Therefore, we should also not make that assumption about something as complex as the universe or the living body. It is, nonetheless, becoming clearer as we understand more about such issues as quantum physics and evolutionary science that this divine intelligence is not necessary. In all likelihood, the universe and all of the things we know to be in it have perfectly non-theistic explanations. Yet, even if every question is ultimately answered, even this won't disprove the existence of God. The deist philosophy is one example of a deity belief in which the Godhead simply set these mechanisms into motion and has had no further impact. Yet the issue of Aquinas' necessary God still remains in that deism. Therefore, one must examine the question from a different perspective. Is there a supernatural creator that is necessary and is therefore appropriate for us to worship? The mere fact that we do not yet have all of the answers to how the universe and time came to exist does not mean that the only possible answer is some sort of a God. The tangentially related quandaries inherent in the unresolved questions in evolutionary theory likewise do not prove the existence of the God of the gaps. However, the lack of evidence for God is not evidence for God's non-existence. So what one is left with is that God is improvable, and his existence can also not be disestablished by what is observable. Yet, either God exists for everyone or he does not exist at all. Therefore, if God's existence is to be disproven, the idea that God cannot exist must be established in the mind of at least one individual. If one examines the deistic concept of God further, one can conclude that whether that God does or does not exist is irrelevant. The universe and life could have formed either way. Therefore, that God is unnecessary. Friedrich Nietzsche once observed that God is dead, as a way of suggesting that there is no order to the universe. His argument supports the idea that God is unnecessary, since randomness and chaos are also naturally governed by entropy and the tendency of things to coalesce. Science is gradually closing the gaps in which many people find God. David Hume even acknowledged that everything one can observe is capable of being broken down into smaller working parts. Yet, he said, this was evidence of a God. However, this is only because he also was acknowledging the limitations of his own understanding. Many of the things which were not understood in Hume's time are now thoroughly explained in science books. Eventually, as human understanding closes the gaps of our understanding, even the God of the gaps will become unnecessary. There is, therefore, no God and no supernatural creator that is appropriate for us to worship. By rephrasing Aquinas, one can posit that if God does exist, God is necessary. Yet God exists only as a concept which certain people need. But for those who do not need God, no God exists. If God does not exist for those people, then God never did exist and does not exist now.